Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate it. That artwork is just amazing. I want some of that artwork for my presentations. I really love that. And Gabrielle, thank you for leading us in the meditation. I was all ready to present, and then I just wanted to meditate for the next hour. So I have to get back into my boat here. So great. Yeah. So I'm going to just give a little presentation on the work of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, at least a few things that may just give us a couple of different ways of thinking about the issue of cultural polarization and political polarization, and maybe a couple tools to work with as we go forward. I founded the Institute for Cultural Evolution, or co-founded it with my partner, Steve McIntosh, about a decade ago. And we had both written a lot about individual and cultural evolution. And we wanted, we were used insights from evolutionary theory, insights from integral theory and integral philosophy, insights from developmental psychology. And we wanted to apply those to the political issues of the day. And so we wrote a long paper on climate and how we could approach the issue of climate. And very quickly we realized that the underlying issue that was preventing so much progress on that issue and on just a host of other issues in our culture was political polarization and cultural polarization. So we began to change the focus of the Institute and really focus on that primarily. And that's kind of been our work ever since. So I'll go through some of that work and share a few things that we've sort of uncovered and the ways we kind of have thought about it, and hopefully you'll give you some interesting perspectives on this. So just to kind of give a few polarization basics here, as cultures evolve, they naturally go through periods of differentiation and integration. We went through a period of more integration in the post-war era. And then we went through, and in the last 4 or 5 decades, we've been going through a period of massive differentiation. We like to say the 60s and 70s broke the post-war consensus, and the culture changed, and a new culture emerged in the 60s and 70s, and it sort of stretched out. So we became more people became more different, if I can say that, in that era. And that set the stage for the polarization we're experiencing today. Now, if you ask political experts to trace back the beginning of political polarization, they often trace it to the 90s, and they talk about Gingrich and Clinton and the fights in those days between all the early fights between politicians in that era. But from our perspective, that was simply the era when that generation, that boomer generation, in which had all those original kind of culture wars in the late 60s and early 70s, they came to political power in the 90s. Whereas in the 80s, you had a different generation of political power. So Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were more willing to kind of get along, and they were part of that post-war era more. But as soon as you had the boomer generation, I'm not blaming the boomer generation. They did a lot of good things, so please don't take it personally. But as soon as they came to power, you had that polarization begin to emerge, and I'll talk about why that is. Again, some polarization is natural in culture and politics. It's when the hyperpolarization becomes an issue that it can be a dangerous thing. And at its very worst, of course, it can lead to a civil war. And people are saying that we're the most polarized we've been in our culture since the pre-Civil War era, which is certainly frightening. And the basis of our work is that culture is upstream from politics. And we've hosted a lot of gatherings and conclaves and small conferences where people working on the issue of political polarization have come and shared their work. And they have all kinds of fantastic ideas about how to change campaign finance and political issues and party affiliations and all this stuff. And they're great ideas, but it's like a chicken or egg thing. Like none of it can truly happen until the culture itself already changes enough so all those things can be implemented. So in a certain way, we feel like addressing things from a cultural perspective is upstream from politics and will help everything else. Of course, these aren't easy issues. These are issues that took us 4 or 5 decades to get ourselves into, and it's probably going to take a few decades to grow out of and evolve out of. So the last thing I'll say here is that the specific issues, political issues or culture war issues, it's often you have to think of those as proxies. The sources of polarization usually run deeper. So to overcome polarization, we need to understand, at the very least, I want to suggest that we can look at the dynamics of polarities and worldviews. And those are the two issues I want to go through a little bit today. So let's start with polarities. So working with polarities. Well, I want to introduce the idea today of a positive polarity. Now, I think we're all used to positive negative polarities, meaning a good and bad polarity, right? So wealth, poverty. That's a positive negative polarity. We want more wealth. We don't like poverty. And we all are familiar with positive negative polarities in our lives. But positive polarities are a different type of thing. They're both have positive elements. They both can have their intention with each other, but we don't want one to vanquish the other. And I want to suggest to you that the left-right polarity, for example, is not a positive negative polarity, although it may seem like that at times, depending on where we stand. It's actually more fundamentally a positive polarity. There are healthy expressions of what politics could look like on the left. There are healthy expressions of what politics could look like on the right. So what are some more positive polarities? We can see some here. Liberty and equality, positive. They're both positive. Real and ideal, right? Mercy and justice. Competition and cooperation. This is one of my favorites. I wrote a whole chapter in my book about competition and cooperation. And my favorite example to use in this is the Beatles. If you think of the magnificence of the Beatles as a rock group and as one of the great rock groups of all times, why were they so great? Well, it was because they had extraordinarily cooperation that they honed over years and years and years of working together. But if you don't have John Lennon and Paul McCartney competing with each other and the energy of that competition, you also probably don't get the greatness of the Beatles. And so competition and cooperation, and in a positive polarity, if it's just all one side or all the other, it tends to decay. Whereas you want the dynamic tension between the two is what creates the best form of a positive polarity. I wrote about this in evolutionary theory. In evolutionary theory, you have the selfish gene idea, the idea of that, evolution is driven by this selfish gene. And a lot of people, that was a real breakthrough when Richard Dawkins wrote that book, a few decades ago. But then other people came out and said, wait a minute. Lynn Margulis is the famous evolutionary theorist who pointed out that cooperative dynamics are absolutely critical in evolution, and that sometimes the best, the cell or structure that evolves the best is really the one where the cooperative dynamics are the most powerful. But it's really not either. If you get too much competition, of course, that leads to a kind of toxic individualism and toxicity. Too much cooperation can lead to stasis. It's the dynamic relationship between competition and cooperation that provides all the energy of evolution. And I want to suggest that the same is true when it comes to our politics of left and right. And I know that may be a leap to understand that, but I want people to consider that idea. So here's just some other positive polarities: part, whole, real, ideal, yang, yin, masculine, feminine, antithesis, synthesis, transcend, include. Challenge, support is a great one. Competition, cooperation. Simple, complex, subjective, objective, you can see. And the one that's most common in politics is the fix what's wrong, preserve what's right. All right, so that's one way of thinking about the issues of polarities. The other one I want to go into that's also so critical when it comes to polarization is the idea of working with worldviews. So, worldviews. This is a big subject. Could spend a long time on this. I'm just going to touch briefly on it just to give you an idea of what we mean when we work with worldviews. So, this is the idea that consciousness and culture co-evolve, and that worldviews represent sets of core values that respond to developmental problems in culture as we evolve in history. And that the values that we share sort of cohere into larger historical worldviews. And there are three major worldviews today active in America, right? Three major worldviews. Now, I apologize that I'll be a little bit American-centric as I talk about this. Our focus at the Institute of Cultural Evolution has been a little more on American politics and American cultural issues, but I think this applies to countries around the world as well. So I apologize for that element. So the three major worldviews in America, I call it the three-body problem. In the Netflix show, if anyone's seen the three-body problem, they have three suns that orbit around each other, which creates a very unstable orbit. So what happened in America is we had two major worldviews. We had the traditional worldview, which we often think of as a sort of more religious or traditional worldview, right? And then we had the modern worldview, which we think of as sort of science and progress and technology, right? The modern worldview started in the Western Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, economic wealth, that kind of thing, right? So the modern worldview and the traditional worldview. When I grew up in a little town in Oklahoma, that was the culture war. It was always between, the modern worldview and the traditional worldview, the religious worldview and the scientific worldview, right? We're very used to that world, that tension. But in the last 40 years, a new worldview has come on the scene, right? And we call this the progressive worldview. And many of the people probably in this call are familiar with this. This is a worldview I lived in much of my life. This is a worldview that has, I like to talk about this worldview, has three essential elements: the ecological element, the consciousness element, and the social justice element. So we have the religious traditional worldview. We have the scientific modernist worldview. And we have this new consciousness, social justice oriented, ecological, environmental worldview. And those are all in tension with each other. They've caused this our culture to fragment and split and break apart. So I want to suggest to you, when it comes to working with worldviews, and you can see probably about 30% in this country or of the country is traditionalist, about 50% is modern, and maybe about 20% is progressive. So when it comes to working with worldviews, it's very important that we remember, as we think about our polarized society, that worldviews themselves are not good or bad. Their expressions can be healthy and unhealthy. And a sure way to increase political polarization is to make someone wrong for their worldview, right? Is to attack their worldview. Now, we can criticize someone's expression that may be unhealthy, but we want to affirm their worldview. And that distinction is so important when it comes to trying to reduce the polarization, because people can have all kinds of strong values, and we can recognize that they can be healthier. Each worldview has very healthy aspects, and each worldview can have unhealthy aspects. In the progressive worldview, we can have emotional intelligence, which is a beautiful, healthy expression of the progressive worldview. We can be an anti-intellectual, which is similar but an unhealthy expression of the progressive worldview. In the modern worldview, we can have, freedom and liberty as a healthy expression of that worldview. Toxic individualism is an unhealthy expression. And it's the same with every worldview. So that one movement of not attacking people's core values and core worldviews, even if we understand that not all of those values may be expressed in a healthy way. So I hope that kind of gives you a sense of how we might work with worldviews to overcome political polarization. So just to wrap this up, we can see that what's a more integrative way of thinking about polarities and worldviews? What can we learn here? Well, we can learn to value non-native perspectives that aren't our own, polarities that aren't our own. And in that, we can develop greater empathy and sympathy and an appreciation for other truths that may not be complete and final truths, but we can appreciate their partial truths. That difference is important. We can learn to appreciate both sides of positive polarities, like challenge and support, or fix what's wrong, preserve what's right. Maybe we have our own preferences, but we can appreciate both sides. We can learn that polarization is not simply a problem to solve, but a condition to grow and evolve beyond. We can learn to separate healthy and unhealthy expressions of worldviews. We can learn the developmental shift of making cultural subject into object, and that's probably too much to go into right now, so I'm going to leave that one alone. And the last one I'll say is we can learn to identify and work toward superordinate goals. And I'll take just a moment to say these are goals that are not limited to just my worldview or my preference or my side of the polarity. Goals that include more of us in their fulfillment, in their work toward that goal. One of the persons I worked with was a man named Don Beck, who's passed now, but he worked with Muzafer Sharif, he was a psychologist who did some experiments at the University of Oklahoma in the 50s with young boys in camps. And they were the kind of experiments you could never do these days. But he found that in order to overcome tribalization, the best way to do it was to work toward superordinate goals, goals that included everyone in the project. So the conclusion of all this is let's work toward bridging divides in a manner that better values both sides of positive polarities, sparks fewer proxy battles, seeks to integrate and appreciate America's three major worldviews, and works toward productive superordinate goals. Thank you so much. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak today.